Good evening and welcome to another episode of Strictly Speaking. We're so happy that you're joining us tonight. I'm Joshua Reaves, the director of University Theater. And tonight, our guest is no stranger to interviews. She is a writer, a podcaster, an arts journalist, the CEO of the award-winning company Beltline to Broadway, Lauren von Hemert. Welcome to the show, Lauren.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'd love to have you tell us in your own words, what is it that you do?
I like to say I'm an arts journalist, and I don't love the title theater critic because I feel like that right off the bat sets up an antagonistic kind of relationship between me as an audience member, as an educated person watching a piece of art or performance, and you as the artists. And so I don't like to have that antagonism. Most theater critics I know love the theater. We love going to the theater. We love seeing shows. So I prefer arts journalists.
Awesome. And what exactly is it when we said we hear writer, when we hear podcaster as it relates to theater, what exactly are you writing about? What are you podcasting about? What is it that you do on that end?
It's kind of interesting, and it's ebbed and flowed through the pandemic. But pre-COVID, I would write about theater. I would go to a show and review it, whether it was a play or a musical, and I'm only reviewing theater. I don't really feel qualified to review opera or music or ballet. There's other journalists much more qualified to review those things. So I just do theater. And my typical pre-COVID life was either going to a show and reviewing it or interviewing the people involved in the show and putting that out on my podcast and having a conversation, not so much as an infomercial for the show, because that's not very interesting to listeners for the podcast, but more diving into the deep themes. So much of theater teaches us about life and the world we're living in and addresses some big issues. And so that's what we talk about on the podcast.
Okay. Now you talked about being qualified for theater. So how did you become qualified? What was how did you begin your career as an arts journalist for theater?
Once upon a time, when I was 15 years old, I was living in Miami, Florida. That's where I grew up. And my mom and I were watching Donahue, which really ages me, but for you kids, it was a talk show, kind of like Oprah. He was a precursor for Oprah and a lot of the talk shows you see, and he's very well respected journalist, wonderful interviewer. And I remember looking at my mom saying, I want to do that. I could do that. And my mom was one of these parents, and I hope I'm the same kind of parent. She never said no to me. She never squashed my dream. She was like, okay, figure out how to make that happen. And I didn't want it to happen later. I wanted to happen sooner. And so I reached out to the director of our public radio station, WDNA Miami, and pitched a show to her called Teen Talk. And within a couple months, I was on the air hosting my own weekly talk show, which is surprisingly similar to my podcast now. It's really very much like that.
And I'm sorry, you were 15 when the show started?
I was 15, and wow. That was it. I knew that's what I wanted to do. I didn't have a real sense that I wanted to be an arts journalist per se. I knew I loved interviewing people. I knew I loved getting the story. I knew I loved writing. And so I went to school and studied journalism. At that time, they didn't teach arts journalism. They just taught journalism. So that's what I went to school for.
I see. And when once you're out of school, what was the first big, maybe a podcast or show or your radio show that you did that you felt like, hey, I'm really doing this now. This is actually working out.
Well, when I graduated from school, I got hired right away as a morning news writer for um, the Fox, what is now the Fox affiliate. And back then, I don't remember who they were affiliated with, but they were the Fox affiliate. And I was working the morning news desk and writing morning news stories for the anchors. And um, I was asked to fabricate the station I was working for. Let me preface this. The
Okay.
station I was working for was responsible for Inside Edition. So that kind of tells you the kind of station I was working for. And very early on, I think I had only been there a couple weeks, I was asked to fabricate um, facts on a story. And I took my journalism classes very seriously. I took my ethics classes very seriously. And so I quit that day and said, I'm not cut out to be a news person.
Mhm.
And then Hurricane Andrew hit my I was going to move to Chicago. I had this dream of moving to Chicago and working for WGN. That was my dream job. And I wanted to work for that station and kind of get into the entertainment side of things. I wanted to work for Oprah. And that's why I wanted to work at WGN. And um, Hurricane Andrew blew my parents' house away.
Oh,
And
wow.
so I never moved to Chicago and began working for the Red Cross, which was doing amazing work, put my journalism career on hold up until about 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago,
Mhm.
and really took this hiatus to work for the Red Cross. I got married, I had kids, I raised my family. And about 4 years ago, I got back into being a journalist. So it was a long hiatus. It was a long road. And I'm really grateful now to be doing what I'm doing because there's a lot of reputable outlets now. But at the time, that career start was a little bit bumpy.
Gotcha. And then, so you mentioned, just 4 years ago, and you, I remember it was about 3 or 4 years ago that I saw RDU on stage pop up on social media and things, and that was the name of the company. What made you, or what was what got you started with RDU on stage? What was the reason for creating that company?
So I had seen several years ago. So my kids, my son went to college. He's a senior now at Virginia Tech. My daughter was going into high school at the time, and they didn't need me to be the PTA mom. They didn't need me to drive them to school anymore. So I was like, okay, now what do I do? And I saw an ad for Broadway World. They were looking for a regional contributing editor for the Raleigh area. There's another young man who does a lot of the musicals and the big shows that come through town. He covers those, but he wasn't covering a lot of the smaller theaters. He wasn't covering the university theaters, college theaters. So they brought me on to expand the coverage. And I was with Broadway World for about a year, made these wonderful connections with theater makers all over the triangle. And after about a year, I kind of felt limited in scope. I felt limited in what I could be doing because I was having these amazing conversations with theater makers, and I thought, oh well, I should broadcast these conversations somehow. And with Broadway World, you're really limited to what you can cover and how you can cover it. And so I was doing some videos for them, but they were kind of not very professional, and I didn't have a whole lot of control. And at the time, another media outlet similar to Broadway World asked for me to come on and expand their Raleigh market. And I was sitting in the theater in the park, and one of the people who works there, Andrea, she said, why would you go to work for this other company and build up their audience
Hmm.
when you could just go to work for yourself? And I was like, oh, I never thought of that before. But I'm kind of an entrepreneurial person and always have been. And so I thought, I really don't have anything to lose. Let's see what happens. And so that's how RDU on Stage started. And it was always going to be only about theater. I didn't want to cover, like I said, opera, ballet, classical music. And I did want to have some sort of podcast. I didn't know it at the time, but I knew I wanted to be broadcasting and sharing these conversations I was having with people, because I think that's almost more important than the review itself. The review is just my opinion. I go to a show, I evaluate what's on the stage, hopefully make some sort of educated opinion about what I'm seeing and report that. But the conversations I was having, that was much more meaningful to me and special. And that turned into the podcast. So
Awesome. Well, and you spoke about how Phil Donahue wanted you wanted to interview. You went to journalism school. You worked for a news company. But what pulled you towards the theater to combine that journalistic skill with with the theater?
So when I went to school, I've always loved the theater. I was a terrible actor. I kind of like directing. I kind of like playwriting. I liked kind of, back of house stuff. Didn't really enjoy performing. Although I did, I was in my high school musicals and that kind of thing, but did not love it and wasn't very good at it. But when I went to school, I majored in journalism and I minored in theater just because I loved it. And I took a directing class. I really enjoyed that. That kind of got me into some of the creative process, the creative decisions that are made. And so that is really how it didn't occur to me at the time that I could weave together theater and journalism. I just knew I liked theater. So I wanted to take theater classes.
Okay. Well, hey, we've got our first question tonight from one of our audience members. David Jones asks, as theater starts to return to normal, what silver lining do you most hope we gain from the pandemic has put us through? From what the pandemic has put us through?
Oh gosh, thank you, David, for that question. I think the silver lining that has come out of the pandemic is seeing how much we relied on the arts to get us through this crazy time. If you've read a book, if you've watched a live stream, if you've attended a Zoom play reading, you're relying on art to get you through this period of isolation and quarantine. So I kind of feel like the silver lining, I hope, is that people will treasure the arts a little bit more than maybe they did in the before times. Maybe new audience will discover the arts. I hope there's just an appreciation for arts and theater makers and artists, designers, who have really been taxed during this time to continue creating. So I hope that's the silver lining, that we all run back to the theater safely.
Yes. Awesome. Thank you, David, for that question. And everyone else, make sure you throw your questions out there. If you can't think of one and you see one pop up, you can also upvote it to ensure that it does get asked. So, Lauren, talk to us a bit about what has been your most exciting or favorite project to date, be it podcast or reviewing a show. Like, what do you look back and go, wow, I really enjoyed that one?
I did that. It's funny. I was thinking about this. So I probably have more than one, but while I was working for Broadway World, I had the opportunity to interview Kristen Chenoweth. I'm a huge Kristen Chenoweth fan. I've seen Wicked a lot. And I think she's ridiculously talented. And so I was really nervous, but I thought, if I can get through it and I can do this interview in a way that I'm not fangirling over her, and I can really have a great conversation with her, and we both walk away and get something out of it, then maybe I can combine my love of theater and make this into a career. And so it was really a defining moment for me. She was everything I wanted her to be. I imagined, you imagine the people that you admire to be a certain way when you meet them. And she was everything and then some that I wanted her to be. She was gracious and lovely and humble and kind. And so she invited me to meet her. There was a concert she was doing in Boone, and she said, come backstage and I'd love to meet you. And my husband was standing behind her, kind of like, please do not do the ugly cry. Wait till we leave the theater for that. And she took my hands. She wears these hand warmers. If you've seen pictures of her out in public, you'll see that she wears these hand warmers, and they're really soft and kind of furry. And so she took me, it was like having a bear paw take my hand. And she said, girl, you got me right. I read the article 3 times. And so to this day, we joke that Kristen Chenoweth is my BFF, but she's really not. But that moment that she even acknowledged that she had read the article, I was just a barrel of tears.
Oh, I bet. I could totally hear her saying, girl, you got me right. Like
girl, you got it right. She had done 2 interviews that week, mine and GQ, and she said, you and GQ, you just get me. And I was like, oh. Okay. So that was a moment. The only other moment that I had this kind of epiphany, the last time I was in New York, I saw a brilliant show called The Wrong Man. It's one of the most exciting things I have seen on a New York stage in a very long time. I hope it goes to Broadway. It was off Broadway. And I had been asked to do this podcasting workshop for a group of theater critics at our national convention. And so I knew I was going to be giving this workshop in this building where this theater that I saw The Wrong Man in, I knew I'd be giving the workshop in this building, but I thought I'd be giving this workshop in like a classroom or some office or something. And so I had gone to see The Wrong Man. I loved it. Joshua Henry was brilliant. Sierra Renee, and then showed up the next morning and they said, you'll be giving your workshop from the stage. And so to stand in the spot where Joshua Henry had given this brilliant performance was really a moment. Because like I said, I'm not a performer, so I don't get to stand on stage very often. But it was the first and last time I will probably ever be on a New York stage. So it was a moment.
Wow. Yeah, that's too great. Oh, wow. Well, let me ask you this. How many shows, now obviously back in the before times, how many shows would you usually see in a year as a theater reviewer, as an arts journalist?
Gosh, for me, I was probably seeing 60 or 70 shows a year. At RDU on Stage, the first year, Kim and Kim was the other reviewer, she's a friend of mine, she and I saw collectively 90 shows that we covered for RDU on Stage in that first year.
Wow.
So we were on a trajectory to cover a ton of, I mean, there were weeks where I literally was seeing 4 or 5 shows a week, and it was like my dream job. I can't go to the theater enough because I love it so much. It's my sanctuary. I always talk about the fact that it's my sanctuary, and it's where I turn my phone off and I'm completely present in the moment. And there's something really magical about that and sacred about that. So I love doing it. I love going, and probably 4 or 5 times a week. On a big month, where there's tons of shows.
Now, for those who may not be familiar about how this works, can you take us through the process? Like, how do I mean, obviously that would be a lot of ticket money you would be spending, but like, how does that work for a theater arts journalist? Like, how do you identify the shows? How long does it take for you to write a piece? And how do you publish them?
Really interesting. So typically we are your theaters will allot a certain amount of press tickets. You can't typically pick your seat. You can't typically pick what night you're going to go. They kind of tell you when you're going and where you're sitting. Sometimes you're sitting in a great seat. Sometimes you're sitting in a crappy seat, but doesn't matter to me. I will sit wherever you put me and I will be happy. So typically the theaters will reach out. They'll tell you, we've got a show coming. You say, yes, I want to cover it. And here's the thing, most theater critics who are not employed by a major newspaper, everybody else, we typically only pick shows that we think we're going to like. We don't want to go to shows that we're typically not going to like. So there's a lot of times when I will, not so much now because I try to be open to a lot of new work, but a lot of theater critics I know is, we get invited to a lot of shows, and at some point you get to pick and choose, and we pick the ones that we're going to bank on, that we're going to be able to write a positive review about, because there's nothing worse than writing a bad review. So that's the first thing. And then I will typically go to the show. When I first started, I'd be meticulously taking notes in the dark, and I can't even read. I mean, I look at some of those notebooks now. I can't even read what I wrote. And it's funny, another theater critic who's really well established, he actually taught me how to take notes in the dark, but it still hasn't helped. I still can't read my own handwriting. So I don't take as many notes during the performance, but I used to come home when I first started. I would come home and I would try to write the review that night. So if I saw a show at 8 o'clock and I got home at 11 o'clock, I was literally staying up all night trying to write a review. And it didn't serve me or the show very well, because I just got tired and I didn't give myself time to process what I'd seen. Um, there's so much good work and thought-provoking work and work that really deserves and commands a lot of thought. And so pretty early on, I decided that staying up all night and trying to write a review was ridiculous, and that I could give myself a day. And so typically I will give myself a day or two. Oftentimes I will have questions about the show. I want to know the production history. I want to know about the playwright. I want to know a little bit of background. When I go into a show, I do not read the play beforehand. Sometimes I know what the play is about. Sometimes I don't. But typically I want to know as little as possible so I can enjoy it like a typical audience member would. But then the next day I will typically dive in and do a lot of research. And once I feel like I have a really good understanding of what the playwright's intention was, what the purpose of the work is, sometimes the purpose is just to entertain, sometimes the purpose is to really give us something to think about. Once I understand that, then I feel like I can dive in and say, okay, did the production achieve that objective? And if it didn't, why didn't it? And who made a choice that didn't align with maybe what the objectives is supposed to be? But oftentimes I'm surprised. Oftentimes, Bright Star at University Theater, this is a wonderful example. I knew very little about the show. I kind of knew that some famous people wrote it, and it had a different sound, but I didn't know a lot about the show. I had not seen it before. I wasn't really familiar with the story. And so I went in blindly. And what I found afterwards, coming home and doing the research on the show, is that your casting decisions actually made the show far more interesting than it probably has ever been before. And so I was like, ooh, if this was cast a different way, I would feel completely different about this show. And so that's a really good example where I'll come home and dive in and do a lot of research about performance history, casting history, kind of the life of the show. The one thing I never do is I will never read reviews of the show. I don't like to read reviews, especially other reviewers here who are reviewing the same show I do. Typically, they write a lot faster than I do. And so they will put out their reviews faster. And I don't look at those until after my review is published because I don't want to be swayed.
Sure. And do you find it difficult or helpful in seeing a production, a title that you've seen before, like reviewing the same show?
It's kind of troublesome.
Yeah.
Because it's very difficult to not compare the work.
I see.
And I'm not talking about like I saw a show on Broadway and now I'm seeing it locally. That's not what I'm talking about. But there were 2 productions of Lady Day that happened, and now there's going to be a 3rd one. So I've seen it twice. It was very hard to Lady Day at Emerson's Bar and Grill, which is kind of a bio play about Billie Holiday. And it was difficult to watch the second show and not compare the performance to the first actor who did such a brilliant job. So it kind of makes it confusing. Still Magnolias is another one that people just keep doing and doing and doing. There's a lot of new work out there. Don't make us see the same show twice. So, but yeah, it is challenging. But I think the idea is to try to keep it, to go into it blindly and trying not to compare. And it's really interesting. Some shows change too, like Mean Girls. I saw Mean Girls in New York. I really liked it. I think Tina Fey is brilliant, and I wrote a really good review of the Mean Girls production in New York. When it came here on tour, I hated it. I just didn't like it. And I couldn't figure out what was different on tour, but they had made some changes to the touring production. And I found some of those moments that were kind of delightful and resolved in New York, they became kind of cringy and problematic for me. So just kind of interesting, but it's hard to review a show twice.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah. Well, everyone, remember, Q&A is open. Throw those questions out to us. So we haven't been in the theater since March for most of us. So going on a year now. What has been going on for the last year? What's been the biggest change or challenge for you or what is now Beltline to Broadway, which we'll get to in a second. But during the pandemic, what's been challenging or changed?
2 things. So when I in the before times when I used to go to a show, everybody was on an equal playing field. Whether I saw a show at Raleigh Little Theater or I saw a show at Theater Raleigh or North Carolina Theater, everybody was kind of on this even playing field, and I was evaluating shows kind of the same and reviewing them. So reviewing, doing interviews, that was kind of the lifeline of RDU on Stage. Once COVID hit, a couple things happened. So I was a trained journalist. This is why I'm not an investigative journalist. When I was in college, I had an internship and I was put on the street with this brilliant news reporter from a news station in Miami. And we were reviewing, at the time in Miami, they were tearing down all these crack houses, and somehow that tearing down all these crack houses was going to solve the drug problem in Miami, which we kind of all knew was not true. And a big story, so she had to cover one story, and then another big story, breaking news, happened somewhere else, and she said, I'm going to send you. It shouldn't be a hard story. So she gave me a microphone and a recorder, and basically there was a bomb threat called into this woman's house, and then there was going to be a bomb threat in this hotel, and they didn't think it was a real threat. There's a lot of strangeness around it, but she was like, just go to the woman's house and see if you can get a statement, and just, hold the microphone out. If she comes out of her house, all you have to do is like hold the microphone out. You don't have to ask questions or anything. Well, me, because I got this adrenaline rush, chasing down the story, literally. The bomb wasn't actually supposed to be in this woman's house. Bomb was supposed to be at this hotel. And I was like, well, forget the woman's house. I'm going to go to the hotel, and I am going to basically run into this building where they think there might be a bomb to try to get the story. It never occurred to me. This is like, chasing a story is kind of like being a drug addict. You just forget where you are. You forget about safety. You just want to get the interview. You want to get the story. So I ran into this hotel. I was quickly escorted out of the hotel and got in big trouble with our news department. And this is why I don't do breaking news, because I realized that I was like a journalism junkie, that if there was a story, I was going to chase it. So when COVID hit, that adrenaline kicked in, and I was like, there is a story here, and I'm going to uncover it. And the story is going to be about the arts and these gig workers who are all out of work now. Everybody's lost their jobs. Theaters have closed. And so I was doing like rapid fire interviews, talking to artists. I think within the first 24 hours of theaters shutting down, I had done like 17 interviews, and I realized I had to slow down and stop. So two things happened. One, I started doing live chats because I was like, okay, stop being a journalism junkie and start being a human being that's going to talk about this story from a humanity perspective. And so I started having these live chats on Facebook. I thought they would last like 2 weeks, and then we get back to business as usual. Of course, that didn't happen. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing is when theaters started producing new work. So all of a sudden we started seeing these Zoom meetings. We saw this onslaught of Zoom plays. Then we started seeing these virtual productions. We'd see some film stage productions. I felt like the arts journalist job has to shift, because the theaters are literally reinventing the wheel. Theater makers are not filmmakers. And so now they have to now experiment with a whole new technology that most of them are not familiar with. And for me to review them as I did before, that was just ridiculous. That was not fair. So for me, the role of the arts journalist became more of a historian, documenting this moment in time. And so these conversations about the creative process, about the challenges that theater makers have encountered, experimenting with new mediums, that has all been part of what we've done over the last year. We've reviewed very few shows. It's only since January that I kind of got a sense that, okay, the theaters are comfortable enough with the technology that I think I can dip my toe back into reviewing, but it's really been just documenting this moment from a historical perspective.
Gotcha. And speaking about the technology that most of the theater makers and well everywhere has had to learn overnight. Thank goodness
You
for you.
became a talk show host, Joshua.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, look at the tables have turned here, Lauren. And but I mean, like, what about you? Like what like a podcaster, you didn't have video in mind. Streaming. How has it been learning and how have you learned about all of this new technology and how has it impacted the way you do your job and your work?
Trial by fire.
Yeah.
It's funny now I have this kind of fancy setup with lights and a more professional camera, but at the beginning I was like, it's more important to have conversations, and
Mhm.
and if I can figure out how to turn my computer on and get the mic to work and get the webcam to work, then I can go on Zoom and start to have conversations. But I had never used Zoom, I had never used StreamYard. I think I had used Facebook Live with some success, a little bit, but not a lot. Certainly not engaging people in conversations, and having some of the really deep conversations that we've had recently. And so for me, technology has um, connected me with community. The really interesting thing is, most of the time as a journalist, you're kind of like on an island by yourself. You go, you review a show, you go home, you're by yourself in your studio. There's not a whole lot of other people to talk to. You're by yourself. What the technology has done for my platform is, because we were having all these conversations early on with so many theater makers, RDU on Stage became this community hub. And I kind of joke that everybody became in my business. So where I used to just sit at my desk by myself writing my reviews, now everybody was a stakeholder in what I was doing and how I was doing it. And everybody had an opinion about the conversations that I was having. Everybody wanted to be in on the conversations with me. It just became a community um, organization in a way that it didn't start. It didn't start as a community organization, but it became some sort of community hub, which has been really beautiful and lovely. But it's also meant that I'm more embedded in the community, I think, than I've ever been before.
Yeah, and that actually leads me to two of my next two questions. First one, do you feel it sounds like you've already answered it, that the you found an increase in viewership or a shift in who your viewers are due to the pandemic? It sounds like that is true. Yes.
Absolutely. So in January of last year, I think we had 500 Facebook followers. Theater critics are not popular people. We typically do not have fans. We don't have followers. People will like us when we write something nice, and they hate us when we write something mean. So it's kind of a catch-22. We don't have a whole lot of friends in the universe. So we went from having those 500 people, which mostly were theater people. They mostly were people inside the theater here in Raleigh, Durham. That's where I was covering theater. So nobody in New York really knew who I was. Nobody in Chicago knew who I was. Certainly nobody in Seattle knew who I was. And so that was it. That was our community. Well, within the first 5 months of the pandemic, our viewership grew from 500 followers to 1,700 followers. And so it is a much larger community. And a lot of those people don't live anywhere near Raleigh, Durham. And that is why we have changed the name to Beltline to Broadway, because people were writing about us in publications in places like Ohio. And then I was getting questions, what does RDU stand for? And I was like, well, what do you mean, what does RDU stand for? RDU is our airport code. Where in the world are you? And they would be like, we are in Australia. Okay, well, so we've rebranded to really honor the national audience that has found us through the pandemic, and sometimes the international audience. So it's really interesting. A lot of our podcast listeners are now in the UK.
Wow.
We have a group of podcast listeners in India, and we have people watching our live chats from literally all over the world. It's kind of interesting. We started, I've become friends with other people like me in other places as well. And so I became friends with this woman who runs a company called Coloring Broadway in Seattle. And we've hosted these virtual coloring parties where she creates coloring pages inspired by musical lyrics. And she connects these musical lyrics to mindfulness exercises. And I interviewed her near the beginning of the pandemic. And we clicked, we really liked each other, we became friends. And on election night, I said to her, I really don't want to be staring at the TV all night, because as a journalist, I know we are not going to have the election results tonight. So it's just going to make me mad and it's going to make me anxious. And so let's have a coloring party and we'll just invite people. And we literally had people from all over the world color with us that night. And now we've hosted 3 or 4 of them and we're not stopping. So it's interesting how the pandemic has kind of made the world a little bit smaller.
Yeah, I was just thinking, like, as we retreat into our own homes and away from each other, we still have somehow become closer together. So that's really cool. Well, okay, so all right, already you on stage, you're doing reviews, you're doing podcasts, but it seems like Beltline to Broadway has expanded, and you've got a whole list of associates and contributors, and even Juan. I would like to hear more about Torn, which is tell us what that means and tell us what that is.
So Torn is Theater on Racist Negativity. That's what it stands for. It is a name that Juan Isler came up with. I had seen Juan perform on stage a couple times, and the last time I saw him perform on stage, he was in a play called Bourbon on the Border, which at Interact, which was a really interesting production that really dove into race relations. Now, this was before COVID, when you actually sat in a theater, and afterwards, the cast came out in the lobby and I started having a conversation with Juan, and we talked a little bit about the themes of the play. It wasn't for broadcast, wasn't for interviewing. And then we walked away, and 2 months later, the world shut down. And I had hosted, so prior to George Floyd being murdered, I had hosted 150 live chats. So the week he was murdered was our 150th live chat. And during that week, I had all these interviews set up and people kept canceling on me. And the response was, you shouldn't be talking anymore. You shouldn't have any more live chats. You should stop talking and start listening. And a group of artists came to me and said, RDU on Stage has become our community hub, and we need to, this was the weekend of the riots. We had seen downtown Raleigh really have crazy things happen. And it was confusing, and it was hard to watch, and it was hard to process, and it was hard to process for a lot of people who were alone in their house. And so a few artists had come to me and said, we just want a safe space where we can get together on a Zoom call and talk about what we're seeing, what we're feeling, and process it. And so we created a Zoom meeting, and I called Juan and I said, I can't, I mean, I'll be in on the meeting, but I can't moderate a meeting like this because I can reflect on what I'm seeing, but this isn't my lived experience. Will you come into this meeting and will you help these mostly young people navigate what they're feeling? And it wasn't broadcast, but it was this really beautiful evening of prayer, of reflection, of community. And afterwards, Juan and I kind of had a conversation, and I said, what if we did this live? Would that work? And we didn't know. Juan said, if we do it, it has to be a diverse panel. And I knew I didn't want to host it, that a person of color had to host it. And so I felt Juan had the personality and the charisma to do it, and the lived experience. And so we did the first torn. 1,700 people tuned in that night. And that was 22 episodes ago. So, and every time we think we might be done, some other horrible thing happens in the world. And Juan and I realize, oh, yeah, we're not done. We got to keep going. So Juan continues to moderate those conversations. I'm usually in the back running tech. And I am always amazed at how much I learn during those programs. And Juan has become a wonderful friend. And, he really has become my brother over this pandemic because of these amazing conversations that we've had. So that's torn.
Yeah. Well, everyone, check it out. I did put it in the chat. I've linked directly to both Beltline to Broadway and the Torn page on there on your website.
Yes.
So tell us, well, maybe you could tell us, is there a next step for Beltline to Broadway? Are there any plans or dreams that you could share with us?
There was a dream. So literally Beltline to Broadway was rebranded a week ago. Mm-hmm. So a week ago, we went from being RDU on stage to Beltline to Broadway. And my plan, my grand plan was to continue to have these conversations and to, to really connect with Broadway performers, New York performers, West End performers, people from all over the world, and bring those conversations home to our viewers here in Raleigh and everywhere else. And so I always had in mind, I was like, oh, I want to do some sort of reunion show. I keep seeing all these wonderful reunion shows. And it's funny what you put out into the universe, but I will be doing a reunion show in May with some stars that I greatly admire and grew up watching. And I'm really excited about it. I can't dive into too much about it because it's still kind of in the talking stages, but it's kind of where I see things going. We're going to keep having coloring nights, community coloring nights and community activities. I guess my vision, when we finally do get back to the theater and we're able to gather safely, is to host maybe moments or events where people can go to the theater with me. I'd love to have groups go to Charlotte. They're doing some brilliant shows at the Blumenthal Center for the Performing Arts, and they were going to do what the Constitution means to me at that venue. And so I really wanted to see that show, but I was like, I don't want to see that show alone. That's going to be a show I want to talk about.
Mhm.
And so if you haven't watched the show on Amazon, you absolutely should. It's brilliant. But so maybe field trips down the road. I don't know. I
Okay.
don't know.
Look forward to hearing about this reunion show and field trips. Maybe Phil Donahue, is he one of your guests? The major.
He's not my guest. He and Marlo, I think, are just, living the dream. I
Doing
don't know.
okay.
No, I
Um,
don't think he is one of the guests. He did come to Miami when I was a kid.
Hey.
He interviewed Gaddafi. I did get to go to that
Oh,
show
wow.
and watch it. And then there was like this after party that I somehow schmoozed my way into getting into. And so I did meet him briefly and said, please postpone retirement because I really would like your job. So can you just wait a little bit? And we took a picture, which is somewhere buried in my parents' house. But yeah, that was my run in. But no, I'd love to interview him though. How great would that be?
Well, okay. So we got a few more minutes left. You have any crazy or funny stories about reviewing a show? Something that exciting or something that didn't go so well or anything like that?
There's always crazy things that happen. But two things that come to mind. So the first thing is I saw, oh, this is a sweet story. And see, this is the one that I didn't write down, but now that you're asking me the question, I'm like, oh, this is kind of nice. Okay, so I went to see Charlie and the Chocolate Factory DPAC. It is not a good show. And I had my notebook in my hand in the dark with my pen, writing down everything that's wrong with the show. It's just not a great show. Those of us who grew up with the movie, it's not the movie. And so writing it down. There's a kid behind me and he's giggling. Like the whole first act, he's giggling. And at first I was kind of annoyed. I'm like, all right, kid, I'm trying to pay attention. Like I'm doing your job here. And then during intermission, he was so enchanted by the show and so enchanted by what he was seeing. He kept saying to his mom, is there more? Is there more? Is there more? And so he giggled all through the second act. And after the second act was over, he asked his mom when he could come back to the theater. And about the time of the ovation or the curtain call, I hear him having this conversation with his mom about coming back to the theater, and he must have been about 7. I just put down my pen and I looked at the person I was with and I said, well done, Willy Wonka. You got another one. And that's literally what I ended up putting in the review.
Oh, wow.
That it really was not a show for me. It was a show for him and for him to fall in love with the theater, which he did. So that's one experience. And a second experience, I had seen Dear Evan Hansen here at DPAC. Okay, show that you've seen twice.
Mhm.
I saw it in New York with the original Broadway cast before they won Tonys, before people had even heard of the show. So I went in blindly, didn't know who they were. It was brilliant and really liked the show, surprised by the show. And then I saw it at DPAC and I was less moved by the show than I was in New York. And so I wrote kind of this lukewarm review, and a young person, I think she was 13 or 14 at the time, she reached out to me and through her mother and said, Miss Lauren, I don't agree with the review that you wrote of Dear Evan Hansen. And I said, well, good, if you can write it better, I'll publish it. And so she did write it, and I did publish it. And replaced my review with hers, and she went on to review many shows for me. And I
Wow.
kind of, like I said, I started when I was 15, so seeing her at 14 have this love of wanting to do this, I was like, yeah, sure, you can write. So I usually tell theaters, if I send her to a show, it's usually a good thing, because her reviews get read much more than mine do. So
That's awesome.
so two kind of cool stories.
Great. Well, we're here towards the end. I've got two questions that we ask all of our guests. The first one, was there a class that you have taken that has proven invaluable to your current career, in particular a class that may not be directly related to your field?
Yes. I took an ethics class, and it really paved the way for me on what kind of journalist I want to be. So ethics, and I do recommend business classes. If you can figure out how to market yourself, how to promote your own services, particularly if you're going to be a freelance writer, I think marketing is really important. So
Awesome. And then finally, the same question we ask everyone. What one piece of advice would you give to someone interested in going into the same career?
to treat others how you would want to be treated. Artists are putting themselves out there on stage, and they are really vulnerable. They've put their heart and soul into a piece of art, and for you to sit in it for 2 hours and say, oh, it's a piece of crap, it can be really hurtful and damaging. So I usually tell people to be very mindful about what you're writing. You're not writing for shock value. You are writing for the love of the art form. And if you can approach arts journalism, theater criticism like that, it will be much more beneficial than just being the shock jock journalists kind of thing.
Awesome. Well, Lauren, thank you so much for tonight's conversation.
Thank
And
you.
everyone, thank you for joining us tonight on Strictly Speaking, where we wish Beltline to Broadway the most luck and look forward to your next shows coming up throughout the week.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Take care, everyone.